Hi, this is Britt with an agronomy update for Idaho the week of June 10th. So it's finally starting to get warmer in Idaho. Crops are finally starting to grow. I was just talking to a grower the other day, and he was telling me, he felt like in April, maybe he was a little ahead of last year. And now in the middle of June, he kind of feels like he's behind last year. And last year was a late year. So we're hoping for more continued warm weather and to the ability, hopefully, to get these crops really going and push and get them to where they need to be. Because it's all about building a canopy right now to get a healthy plant to grow a good crop. So along with the warmer weather, we have had some windy conditions. Shocker, it's June. Those windy conditions, along with warmer weather, can sometimes make it a challenge to keep up with irrigation water. I've seen a few fields where they were maybe a little short on water. Some of it was just timing with moving water around and doing things. But when we get windy weather and we have warmer weather and we have these big rapid areas of grand growth in these crops, we can really get a shortfall in irrigation or in moisture in our soil. And so that's really something to think about this year as we go into the warmest part of the year, the longest time of photo period, which I think is June 20th, coming up here with our summer solstice as well. A couple things that were different this week. I got a few more calls. Last week, I think I had one or two. This week, I think I had 5 or 6 calls on grasshoppers. So I've mentioned in the past that we are starting to see some grasshoppers at higher elevations. And now, not only are we seeing those grasshoppers at higher elevations, we're starting to see them in some of the crop areas too. And so if you're farming in an area that has historically had issues with grasshoppers, you need to be on the watch out, because it is middle of June. And if we're seeing grasshoppers in the middle of June, typically the pressure only goes one way, and that's up. So keep an eye out for grasshoppers on all your crops. And I would tell you too, when we look at a crop like potatoes, we are still having a few later planted potatoes in eastern Idaho and some of the seed areas that are just emerging out of the soil, but those are starting to come along and looking good. Folks are doing their groundwork there if they need to, as far as cultivating as these spuds start to pop up, and getting their herbicide programs in place on those late planted potatoes as well. In grain in the Magic Valley, I think all the grain is pretty much completely past that period of herbicide management or weed management. And we're actually, a lot of the winter grain is headed out or beginning to head out, and it's looking pretty good. Weed control has been a little bit of an issue as a broad kind of topic this year, because I think some of the application timings were a little delayed because of some of the weather challenges we had. When we had frosty days and when we had really windy days and when we had rain, not a lot of herbicides got put on or applied to wheat or barley fields. And so then those delays happen. And when we make these delays on these applications, these weeds tend to keep on growing. In fact, at some points, weeds actually can grow faster than the crop, depending on the weed and depending on the temperature. When we have that happen, we can have challenges with managing these weeds in these crops. So keep that in mind. If you haven't taken action on your spring grain, maybe don't sit around and wait. Get after it. Get on it early. The earlier the better. I've always talked about the credit card is my cutoff for a big weed. If a weed is taller than a credit card or a business card, it's a big weed in my book, and that's a lot harder to control. The bigger the weed is, especially if it's a broadleaf like kochia or lamb's quarter, the more growing points it has, and the harder it is for us to cover all those growing points and get the kind of control we're looking for. So think about that as we look into corn and we shift gears and talk about corn. The corn's looking pretty good, actually. A lot of folks have corn in the ground with stands up and are getting their herbicide programs in place, or maybe have already done that. A lot of residual herbicides have gone out on corn. Surpass herbicide is one of the products I represent, and a lot of Surpass acres have been put out. I would tell you this, I think residual herbicides for right now in southern Idaho are more important than they've ever been in corn in sugar beets and potatoes and all these crops where we can use residual herbicides. We need to use them as a really valuable tool, because a weed that's not emerged, a weed that does not emerge, can't become resistant to Roundup. And right now we have some issues with Roundup resistant weeds in Idaho. And we're concerned about those getting worse, like they have in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And so we need to use all the tools we have in our toolbox. Yes, we're going to use conservation tillage. Yes, we're going to use cultivation in some places. Yes, we're going to do all these other things we can to manage weed pressure, but we need to think about residual herbicides in every crop we grow. And if there's a fit, you definitely need to look into that. And you can reach out to me because I've got a few that may fit your crops, but there's a lot of other options out there too that you can look at for residual herbicides. In sugar beets, so speaking of weeds, I've talked about volunteer potatoes a lot in sugar beets, continuing to get calls. You know, it kind of goes hand in hand. When we have grasshoppers, we probably maybe had a milder winter and not a lot of kill of some of the overwintering grasshoppers. And also when we have a milder winter and we don't have as much freezing temperatures, we tend to have more volunteer spuds too. So along with a pretty good crop last year in potatoes, we had a lot of undersized spuds probably left in these fields. And then we didn't have a lot of frost in that top few inches where those seed pieces were, those tubers were, and here comes all the volunteer spuds. In sugar beets, we still have folks going out with Stinger on these sugar beets to control it. In grain, a lot of people have actually switched gears with some of their herbicide programs, have started to use some of these chemistries that contain that Stinger technology. So some of the more common ones would be wide match or perfect match. And you just have to remember that if you have potatoes in the rotation, you need to be aware of that, because it's an 18-month plant back when you have wide match or perfect match application go on your grain. And so realistically, it's 2 years. So be aware of that, but that product or those products will very much help you manage this volunteer potato issue that we have this year in southern Idaho especially. So those are some of the things that are going on in southern Idaho. I'd like to know what's going on in your area. You can message me or reach out to me in the comments and let's have a conversation. I hope you're staying safe and I hope your crops are growing well. We'll talk to you soon.